of topics to discuss, so let's get going. This is the note well. Hopefully you've seen this before. This applies here. If you're not familiar with it, please get familiar with it. It's important. Meeting tips. The most important part, please make sure to log in so we know how many people are here and to be able to join the queue and ask questions. Talked about this, and here's our agenda for today. As you can see, there are lots of topics too, so we'll start with the token status list and attested-based client authentication. We're gonna switch the third and fourth topics with transaction token, and after that specific credentials, but after that we continue as specified here. That's it. Let's see and get going here. Who joined? Christian, okay. Christian, will you be driving?
Yes.
Okay. Just give you control.
Perfect, thank you. So I guess let's start directly on the token status list. Yeah, we don't intend to talk too much about it. It has passed second working group last call, but a very short refresher. And perhaps question, can you hear me properly?
Yes.
Perfect, okay. So yeah, key facts about the status list. It's intended to be a scalable revocation mechanism with similar privacy properties as CRL, simple to understand and easy to implement. That was like a big focus of us, and compatibility with HOSE and COSI based credentials and credential formats. It's currently referenced in SC.VC and in the ISO MDL and MDoc. And it's also named as one of the status mechanisms in the European RIF. We had a good amount of test events and hackathons where this was tested also recently, and I would say results were pretty good. So I think we are in a decent state there. Also, the draft is not only one mechanism, but it establishes an extension point and a registry in general for status mechanisms, which I think is important. Bigger picture. So we have a token. We have a status list that is referenced by the token, and the status list is conveyed in either JSON or CBOR format in these respective status list token. And we have the dependency. So we refined terminology a bit. We have defined issuer, status issuer, and status provider to be able to describe all kinds of different deployments for the mechanism. We have the holder. We have the relying party, and the spec describes all of the different interactions between these parties. Changes between the last IETF and now. So we can see that there were 3 new revisions of the draft. But I would say apart from very small, minor normative changes, these were all mainly editorial. So we had a bit of feedback after the last IETF that we incorporated. There was also a bit of feedback regarding the IANA registrations that we incorporated, and we Rifat gave very valuable feedback on the normative statements. So whenever we had a should, explaining why it was a should, we changed, I think, 2 normative statements also and relaxed them a bit more. But those were the main normative changes, and they happened, I think, in April, May mainly. The biggest changes I would say we had was the relaxation of the accept header. So in the request from a client to request a status list token, the request header is now a should, not a must. That was the outcome of a larger discussion about that part. And we allowed the key usage OID field that we defined to be used by other mechanisms that are in the IANA registry that is created by this draft. To give a bit of context on that part, There is a draft that builds on top of status list currently in the ISO world, which uses a very similar mechanism, but it uses identifiers instead of our indices. And the idea was to be able to reuse the key, basically, and the key ID for that. So we don't have to manage different key IDs for that specific mechanism. These were the last changes we did. And current status quo is that we incorporated all open issues and PRs. The 0 open issues isn't entirely true because last week there were 2 new issues open, but I think these were old discussions. So we basically looked up the old discussions and referenced them, and we are waiting to proceed the document in the Shepherd review. And we are also seeking a bit of guidance if there's anything that we can help to speed up right now. And I think that would be the main part on status list from my side.
Okay. Any comments, questions? Okay. Christian, as I mentioned, my goal is I've started kind of looking into the document as a Shepherd write-up. I'll try to get to it soon, but it might take me a few more weeks because of still travel and conferences, other conferences. So I'll get to this soon.
Thank you.
Okay. Anything else in this, Christian?
Not from our side, I would say. I think we're pretty happy with the state it's currently in.
Okay.
So yeah, we would like to get this over the finish line now.
Sounds good. Okay, let's stop this then. Will you be talking will you be presenting this one or somebody else? Tobias?
Tobias will be presenting this one.
Tobias, okay. Let me
Awesome.
control Tobias.
Thank you. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So just quickly, a bit of a refresher on this draft. So traditionally in OAuth today, client authentication is generally through a confidential client or a backend. You know, the type of clients capable of client authentication are those that can keep secrets and traditionally known as a confidential client. However, limitations and have come about with certain applications such as OpenID for VCI, which is a verifiable credential issuance model where there's drawbacks of performing client authentication in that traditional way. And so this draft establishes a mechanism for what we call back-end attested client authentication that enables the front-end instance to basically obtain an attestation and use that as client authentication directly to the authorization server. There's a bit more of a slide on the flow here. So basically, we have a client instance that will generate an attestation key, perform a protocol in steps 2 and 4 with the backend to get an attestation, which is a JWT. The protocol steps of 2 and 4 are out of scope. The specific, like how the client instance gets an attestation from its backend are out of scope in the draft, but what is standardized is the representation of that client attestation and the client attestation proof of possession, which are used jointly when the client instance authenticates itself and its interactions to the authorization server in steps 5 and 6. And the authorization server has a pre-existing trust relationship to the attestation key, allowing it to authenticate the client instance. So some changes for since IETF on 122. We've made a variety of different changes. clarifying the client ID processing and token requests with client attestation, the usage of client attestation in and outside of OAuth2 applications directly as well, some general language. We've added some OAuth error response values specifically for interactions with the authorization service. We've extended the general OAuth2 error with 2 new possible error types for specific situations related to this draft. One of the biggest ones, which we'll talk to today, is that we've reverted the HTTP options mechanism for fetching nonces to a term we're now calling challenge, which is part of the next change there listed. And then we've made quite a few changes to some of the security and implementation considerations, and two other changes that have been discussed around removing EXP from the client attestation POP and added verification and processing rules. So I'll just go through the most consequential changes, which are the ones highlighted in red. So we defined originally a mechanism that was using an HTTP options request for the client instance to obtain a fresh challenge from the authorization server to be used in the POP, similar to server-side nonces, basically a feature similar to server-side nonces in Depop. However, we found drawbacks with using HTTP options in that way, namely in browser environments where it would be possible to have multiple pre-flight requests because of how cross-origin requests work on the web platform. And ultimately, that led us to restructuring the mechanism towards a dedicated challenge endpoint using the HTTP post verb instead of options. We've also defined how that challenge can be conveyed in any HTTP response, not just the challenge endpoint, via HTTP headers, so that in the event the challenge is being returned from another endpoint response because of efficiencies in a protocol, there isn't a dedicated endpoint that has to be called in all instances to get a fresh challenge value. And we've added new areas to sort of signal when this challenge is invalid or missing. We've made several updates to the security and implementation considerations, namely adding a lot of text around freshness of these attestations, proof of possessions, and how that plays into things like replay protection of this client authentication mechanism, namely sort of zoning in on how implementations can use things like JTI and the client attestation POP, and caching known or seen JTIs for a level of replay attack protection, and challenges in cache for freshness guarantee. So next off, in terms of considerations, one outstanding point we have for discussion today that we wanted to sort of re-raise is that in the event this client authentication mechanism is being used in conjunction with Depop, specifically at the token endpoint, there becomes some complexity and an optimization that's worthwhile considering that we wanted to re-raise to the group. So effectively, if you use this client authentication mechanism alongside Depop at the token endpoint, there becomes effectively 3 JWTs an authorization server must validate. One is the client attestation, the second is the client attestation POP, and the third is the Depop proof. We've become aware of numerous situations where the key and the client attestation POP and the Depop proof could be the same key, not always. We're certainly not saying this is universal. There's many situations where the 2 keys may be different, but in the event that they are the same, should we consider an optimization where the Depop proof can be used in place of the client attestation POP, thus making the implementation somewhat similar. And we have a bit of a proposal to describe how that would look. So this is Depop and client attestation without an optimization. So here you can see you would have 3 HTTP related headers, each with a JWT serving different purposes. So the first is Depop as defined by the pre-existing RFC. And then when you're using client attestation as a form of client authentication, you would have 2 additional Depop headers. And again, we think this model is very valid in many instances, but when the client attestation POP key and Depop proof key are the same, is it worthwhile having the following optimization, which is where the request would effectively only have a client attestation header, and there would be no OAuth client attestation POP, because the Depop proof would be performing the proof of possession. So effectively, the key pair and the client attestation confirmation claim of the client attestation, would match the public key used to verify the Depop proof. So some discussions really is we're looking for some feedback on the challenge endpoint. So we've made those changes after significant discussion, and thanks again to all those that have provided feedback on the updates to the challenge endpoint. The open question is around the Depop optimization, and is this something we should pursue? And then lastly, beyond this optimization, we feel the biggest questions of this draft are resolved, and looking for more guidance or feedback on whether or not there are other things we're missing in this draft. Thank you.
A quick question. You say the biggest questions have been resolved, and above the sentence there's the question. So that's so you say, like, if that question is answered about the Depop optimization, then all of it is resolved. So how do you want to resolve that?
Yes.
So from our perspective, I would say the challenge mechanism was by far the biggest pain point we had. And we had lots of discussion. I think we're in a decent state right now. And I think the most important part for this spec would be to get feedback from the working group if everyone is happy with the current design. And the Depop optimization, that is an optimization. The whole draft works without it, right? So the question is, do people see value in adding it? But like the by far biggest hurdle was the challenge part, the endpoint.
Do we have someone who wants to provide some feedback on, for example, the challenge endpoint and that resolution?
I don't have an opinion on the challenge endpoint at the moment. In terms of the Depop optimization, I'm curious if there's been any security analysis done on whether there are any security risks from reusing a proof that is meant for one thing, using it in a different context. That's a question for the authors.
That's a good question.
Yeah, I did just want to probably highlight one potential security benefit that I think is interesting to explore here. Obviously in Depop, because the draft is, it's not the stated intent of the draft, but using the client attestation here, you can effectively attest the Depop key, which may be a useful property in some instance. So the key that's used to bind to the access token with this optimization, if it were the same, could be used as a form of attestation of the Depop key. I know that's probably a larger conversation, but when it came to security considerations, I thought that was potentially an interesting property.
I'm not sure.
I don't think there's anything to be worried about in using the same key to send a signed message to the same entity. Maybe I'm too naive, but I know that's come up before, but I think we should not worry about this. And for certain deployments, this optimization will be really nice, both from a performance and efficiency standpoint, and just like looking at on the wire, like why there will be questions like why are there so many proofs and signatures going over there? Can't we do better? And having this as an option for the places that could make use of it, I think is totally reasonable. So I'm in favor of the optimization. I was the idea behind the idea before the endpoint that people really didn't like, and I'm told that the endpoint works better. So I'm also in favor of that. And lastly, I'm wondering if there's a flip on the optimization too, similar to what was done in another protocol layer. Do we talk at all about the ability to receive a depop nonce from this new challenge endpoint and potentially use that later, as that might be a nice optimization as well? I think technically it's sort of allowed by things already, but it might be a nice note to just mention that flow could occur.
To answer on the nonce endpoint also providing depop, I think we have an open issue for that in VCI, and it absolutely would make sense to mention that in this draft as well. So one of the intention, the way we currently formulate the challenge endpoint would be also that it can be useful for other drafts. And I think a lot of depop usages right now run into similar problems where it would be nice to have this kind of endpoint for depop.
Brian, is your security judgment, is that a gut feeling or a result of an analysis? A stupid question, but
I mean, is it?
Of course, given your expertise.
I have no training in formal analysis, so it could be nothing more than a gut.
Something else.
It's a gut feeling that I believe. I know we talk a lot about formal analysis, but everything we do here is gut feelings, and so I'm pretty comfortable with it.
I completely lost what I was about to say. The challenge endpoint works way better than what was there before. I did an experimental implementation, and to respond with the challenge endpoint, to put the depop nonce header into the challenge endpoint response was naturally a thing I did. Yes. I do believe that there's an open issue about just adding some text to hint towards being able to do that. But
speak to the mic.
I'm sorry, Rifan.
Yeah.
So it was naturally a thing that I did. It would be great if it was explicitly mentioned as something that can be done or that should maybe be done. About the optimization in here, it is really important to realize that the authentication method itself will be usable on endpoints that do not necessarily accept depop, and in those instances, the client needs to be ready to use it with or without depop anyway. And since whether depop is passed or client authentication passed can be done in entirely different sections of a client code, one may not know about the other, so it may very well be the case that some clients will not be able to say whether they should do the optimization or not, because at the point when they're creating the attestation pop, they don't know whether depop will be used or vice versa. Brian says that maybe that's okay, and maybe that is, yeah. Right. What needs to be made, what the authorization server needs to make sure of, is that when it's making use of this optimization, that the mechanism that it applies to the depop nonce is exactly the same that it would otherwise apply to the attestation pop, so that it is exactly the same level of insurance in terms of freshness or reuse and so on and so forth. On the topic of maybe bigger things that we are missing, I don't necessarily think that that's a bigger thing that we're missing, but the draft briefly talks about use of this attestation, of the attestation headers at a resource server. But if you count, the draft says resource server exactly 3 times and doesn't mention it in any broader capacity. So either we need to expand on the usage with a resource server a lot or get rid of it entirely. Thank you.
Aaron.
That is a good point on the resource server. We initially intended to add more text, but it would also be a good point to get feedback on if people would be interested to use this also at a resource server.
Aaron?
We can't hear you.
Okay. Maybe we can go to your own and come back to him.
There we go. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Wrong microphone. Yes, thank you. I definitely would like to use this at resource servers. I think it's worth expanding that in the draft. I think there's a lot of value in being able to do that, to use this at resource servers. On the optimization question, just to be clear, this is an optimization, right? Not so it's a possible thing to be able to do. I think that
Yeah, correct, Darren. So it wouldn't be
Great.
you have to do it like this. This is
Okay,
just
great.
in the event that you want the key to be the same and you want to deal with one less signature in the token request.
Yeah, I think Philip made some really good points. So the other case where this might happen is when there's a different, like a HTTP reverse proxy in front of the API that might be validating the attestations, but then your actual application is validating the depop proofs. So that, it's just another example of a deployment that might not be able to combine them. So as long as it's possible to not combine them, I'm happy with the optimization when it makes sense.
Thanks. You're on.
Yeah, thank you. So I can think of a use case that this optimization violates. We have been looking at this draft also as a way of securing front-end clients like web sessions and mobile native app instances as a way of establishing trust by their backend, and Depop we associate more with confidential clients. So those might be secrets managed by two different layers of the architecture. And then assuming that the ephemeral web page session or the native client will have the key to establish Depop as a confidential client kind of violates that. So I see the reason why they should be separate to support these use cases, like two different frameworks of trust.
Okay, thanks, Yaron. Can we get people to volunteer to review this document and provide feedback? Yaron, Philip, Brian, and Andrew. Thank you, Andrew.
And another Yaron.
Oh, Yaron. Oh, David.
Peter.
And Peter. Oh, perfect. Awesome. People are still awake, so that's good.
What too tired to realize what the question was. But good, thanks.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Tobias. Anything else? Do you want to wrap it up or something?
No, that's it. Thank you very much.
Okay, awesome. You got lots of people to review the documents coming your way, so get ready. Okay, let me grab this. Peter, I think we want you to start here. Grab this. Give you the clicker in a second.
Alrighty, it's Friday afternoon at the IETF. If you are awake, this is the presentation on transaction tokens. I'm presenting on behalf of my co-authors, Atul and George, and this is what ChatGPT thinks Madrid looks like. So it's almost right. Quick recap on transaction tokens. It's really meant to be this mechanism where you can effectively do token exchange within a given trust boundary. It allows you to maintain this context of the subject, the context, and authorization details. So the idea being your external endpoint gets an access token, sends it to the transaction token, and then gets a token back that is bound to that session. You can then share that across multiple workloads, and you don't have to forward the access token all the way down. So you reduce the threat or the risks of token exfiltration. It also allows you to downscope the transaction and is really helpful if you want to deploy finer-grained authorization. So basically a mechanism to persist some of this data. Couple of merges since the previous, since IETF 122. I think Dean Zaks did a good review for us, and so as a result of that, he found some inconsistencies around how we talked about expansion of scope. So one of the things that we didn't want to happen is that a transaction token can have more scope than the access token that was originally handed in, and so we tightened up the language around that to be more consistent. And then there was also some feedback from some implementers that was thinking about using transaction tokens for authentication purposes. And so we clarified that a transaction token is an authorization construct, not an authentication construct. A couple of non-normative text clarifications and again, some known implementations, so Keycloak, Tokenides, we also know of some other ones as well. You will need to read the PR. I believe that was George. These are just the titles of the issues.
Brian, go to the mic, please, if you want to say anything.
Not for that.
No.
And not for that,
No, no.
because we have, if like we are really short on time.
We're short on time. I was asking who Mai was, but implicit in that was like that it demonstrates a real lack of awareness of the audience of the content that's being written, like, or how it will be consumed or addressed. So I hope that that's not indicative of the larger content of the document.
I hope so too. In fact, I'm confident it is not. Thank you, Brian. Okay, got some known implementations. There's also several other implementations. It's proven to be quite a popular specification in this way. One of the outstanding issues is around the HTTP header format, which I believe has been resolved as of yesterday. Ratul at least has, I don't know if Ratul is online.
Yeah, I'm online.
Yeah. Atul, do you want to maybe talk about this briefly?
Sure. What we, we went to the HTTP working group to understand, because there was a comment from the IANA, I mean, somebody who reviewed the draft that was updated the last time, that they said that, can you look at which structured header type that they should use? And, we looked into it and we concluded, based on discussions with the HTTP working group, that none of the existing structured types make sense for this, and so we will keep it as an unstructured header and not have a structured type. So we're kind of back to where we started, but now we have the confidence that we won't run into trouble when we try to get this draft through.
I see Brian's head nodding in different directions. Okay, you want to go to the mic or? Okay, good. Thank you. You're on.
So I'll
I'll probably nod my head the opposite direction from Brian. My question is, if everybody's bumping into the same issue, maybe we should go back to the HTTP band with a request to have a new structured header that would fit our need, instead of everybody doing ABNF to go around it.
Yeah, I suggested that on the mailing list. There was no uptake on that request, but I think we can take that up separately.
So I think Atul, the suggestion on your side is it's a good idea. If we want to do that, there's no reason to have this specification blocked behind that process. Is that right?
Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking.
I totally agree with that, but still.
Thanks, Yaron. Anybody else in the queue?
Justin is in queue. Yeah.
Hey, everybody. So structured fields were designed to add a parsable structure to values that weren't otherwise known to be readily parsable. Jose already has, and Jot in particular in the compact format like this, already has a very well-known and parsable structure. So adding on top of that at the HTTP layer doesn't make a ton of sense. Additionally, Jose was designed to fit specifically inside of token 68, which is an existing ABNF rule from the HTTP spec, and not run afoul of that. That's why we argue about dots and squigglies, and we only have a handful of characters to work with. So for things like this, while it might be nice to have something to indicate in HTTP specs that this is a compact JOT in a more easy way, it's not going to be a structured header field. That would be, in any event, adding additional structure so that it could be parsable in the structured field formats. So I say keep it as unstructured field.
Thank you.
Thanks, Justin. Atul?
I just said thank you to
Okay.
Justin.
Thank you.
Dimitri?
Hi, everyone. Dimitri Tseligan. Peter, the document already mentions SPIFFE in a couple of places. And I think that the other document you're working on, automatic registration for all SPIFFE clients, applies perfectly to TTS. And maybe even it's more relevant to TTS than to like generic AS. So my question is, does your other document like automatically apply to TTS? Or maybe we need to mention that in this document or the other or both?
Dimitri, sorry, I'm not sure I followed the question. Can you just repeat that again for me?
Actually, well, we can continue that on Slack or anywhere else. So do you think that automatic client registration for SPIFFE clients applies to transaction token service? I think it does.
It could. Let's take it offline. I mean, it wasn't meant that way. What it was really meant for is that if you have a SPIFFE, the way we talk about SPIFFE in the document is if you have a SPIFFE credential, you can use that for authentication and to authenticate the client. That was really the intent, more in that line. We are not, again, I do not believe anything we do around the registration discussion needs to become blocking here. We should keep those things separate. Because we're still figuring out the registration story.
Yeah, makes sense. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay. So from the author's perspectives, at this point, we're sort of at a point where we feel like there isn't really any big outstanding issues at this point. The HTTP header format issue, we believe, is now addressed. And we believe that it is ready for working group last call, looking at the chairs, and hoping that there will be people who would like to review that if the chairs would agree to a working group last call.
Anybody has a problem with us starting a group last call? Yeah, I think it's reasonable. We'll do that.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. Okay. I hate this. I have to take this clicker first, and then drop this, and then press this. It's not going to allow me. There you go.
Hello, I'm Anshang Schuster, and Peter and I want to talk about OAuth specific client authentication. I did add our GitHub handles there because there's been some confusion, and my GitHub handle is my first name and the first character of my surname, Brian. Okay. Yeah, cute. All right, Spiffy, Peter is doing a much better job in explaining what it is. It's a CNCF project. It stands for Secure Production Identity Framework for Everyone. And it has a lot of various topics. And what's relevant today is the SVID. It's a single verifiable identity document. And there is 2 SVIDs at the moment, which is an X509 certificate. I refer to it as X509 SVID, and a JSON Web Token SVID. JSON Web Token. Trust boundaries in Spiffy are defined as trust domains, and you can define custom trust boundaries depending on your environment, development, production, or HR and finance. And it's used across the industry. Peter had a really nice slide with various vendors, but so today, if a workload, that's the green thing, communicates to other workloads, it uses, that's down, the Spiffy SVID, either an X509 certificate or a JOT SVID, to communicate to other workloads. However, if a workload also needs to authenticate and authorize users, it needs to talk to an authorization server, and for that, it needs a client ID and a client secret. And compared to the Spiffy SVID, which is automatically provisioned and rotated, short-lived, and has proof of key position capabilities, the client ID and client secret is manually provisioned, needs to be manually rotated, is rather long-lived, and after all is a bearer credential. So what if we could use the existing credentials we have provisioned by Spiffy to use towards authorization servers to authenticate OAuth clients? That would allow us to leverage existing infrastructure. We don't need to worry about lifecycle, rotation, provisioning, and we have less secrets we need to protect. So the idea is that this Spiffy SVID can be used as authentication measures to other workloads, but also towards authorization service in OAuth. So our proposal is to use RC 7523, the client authentication part, for the JOT SVID, and we also profile 8705, which is the MTLS client authentication for the X509 SVID, as means of authentication from the workload to the authorization server. The authorization server then uses the Spiffy bundle endpoint, which is Spiffy spec, but it basically is JWKS, to get the keys from the Spiffy environment, which has basically issued these JOT SVIDs and X509 SVIDs. Currently, our outline is basically the profiles of 7523 and 8705. It's tough. Then we do talk a bit about trust establishment and client registration. I do want to point out this is not any sort of trust on first use, all these sort of client registration parts Peter has talked about yesterday is out of this draft, because we do believe that this one is much more profile, and so this is not talking about trust on first use. And then we do have a section about key distribution and validation. That is basically that SPIFFE bundle endpoint we kind of specify. And then some security considerations. It's pretty straightforward. Yeah, so we would like to hear your opinion, feedback, and or experience on this topic. Dimitri.
Yeah, go ahead, Dimitri.
There is a section in the document named alternatives to avoid. So in terms of key distribution. So one of the alternatives to avoid is OIDC based, OIDC discovery based key distribution. So one of the reasons why it's not recommended. So you're mentioning the ISS claim might be absent from JOTSFIT, which is correct. But as we are profiling 7523, okay, JOTS for client authentication, that document requires the presence of ISS claim. So it's mandatory. So the question maybe to the whole group, when we are profiling any documents, can we relax requirements like that? I believe we cannot. Even if we could, that could lead to issues with existing implementation. So take, for example, Keycloak. It has pluggable mechanisms for cloud authentication, but even if you develop a plugin for SPIFFE, the ISS check will happen first, even before the execution is dispatched to the plugin. Okay, could it make sense just to assume that the ISS claim be always present and require from SPIFFE users to enable that Inspire? So Inspire server is supported as well. What do you think?
Maybe for context for everyone, the JOT-SVIT in SPIFFE does not carry the ISS claim by default. Many people add it. That is because ISS kind of gives the notion of here I can find keys, and SPIFFE has its own way of key distribution. Not necessarily, but it very commonly in client implementation carries that impression. And that you can do OpenID federation, find shared requests, and so on. And SPIFFE has its own way of key distribution, for example, via the SPIFFE Trust Bundle endpoint. And this is the reason why we said we would not want implementers to use the ISS claim, but actually use the SPIFFE Bundle endpoint, because we are talking about a SPIFFE profile. Whether we do require it and say, okay, we're going to use ISS or not, that's up to us. Dimitri, maybe you can create an issue, or we can create one and
yeah, definitely. So if we decide that we can rely on the presence of ISS claim, we can promote that OIDC discovery based mechanism to recommend it. Okay. So and to have two alternatives, SPIFFE bundle and OIDC discovery. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dimitri. Joe?
Joe Salloway. I haven't had a chance to look through your draft yet, but I was wondering how audience is handled. Are you able with SPIFFE to get JOTs with a specific audience?
Yes.
Okay, so then you can say, I want this JOT for this purpose.
Yes, perfect. And it will be basically on RFC 7523 and RFC 25 bis. And we are still checking that if everything matches, but it will be basically the issuer of the authorization server.
Okay, thank you.
So you just described that it might be a little bit different. So Jeff Lombardo, sorry. You just described that it might be a little bit different if it's JOT SVID or if it's X509 SVID. I'm not sure one single draft should be done for both, because you might have different stuff and you are building on top of those two RFCs that exist. So maybe a profiling onto each one of those with a specific draft in order to say the specificities if we are into JOT client authentication, and another draft if we have the specificities for MTLS client authentication might be better.
Yeah, I'm flexible for this generally. However, I would still say that a lot of the trust establishment, client registration, key distribution, validation is more or less the same. And it's more like the actual authentication path or way there's these two options. If the working group feels like this needs to be completely split out, yeah, we can do that. Okay, we are almost at time, 50 seconds left. Is this something you feel like we should be working on? Maybe can we have would it be possible to do a poll, or maybe, yeah, I got a bit of feedback, but.
Yeah, poll for what? Exactly.
Whether, yeah, I guess.
I'd like to a little bit much.
Yeah.
Let people kind of provide, review it, provide feedback, and let's see how it goes, right?
Okay.
It seems that it looks like there is interest, so we'll see how it goes.
Cool.
And then obviously, like it's a new document, so if people take a look at it, review it, provide some feedback to you, and of course to the list, that would be fantastic.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Hello, everyone. So in Bangkok, I didn't have any internet drafts. I just presented an idea. Quick recap of that around refresh token expiration and consent expiration. So there are two different but related concepts. There's consent expiration, which is how long the end user's consent is good for, if they wanted to give a time limited access for sensitive data. And then there's credential expiration, which is how long the actual credential is good for, which would be applicable for something like when you're doing refresh token rotation, if the client needs to present that token to you within a certain time window. So use cases, since that was a question people were asking, is for consent expiration. We actually at Google have received a number of requests from real clients who want to proactively remind the user that their consent is expiring so that they don't run into an interruption of service when that consent just expires on Sunday at 3 a.m. or something like that. And then for refresh token rotation, it's what I mentioned, that the client, if they use the token infrequently, for example, it might be a refresh token that only ever gets used when the user shows up at a site, they might need to know if they need to proactively be rotating that. So everyone else has this slide. I thought it looked fun. So the changes since Bangkok are it exists. So I have the links there. So the TLDR basically adding two new parameters to the token endpoint response. Refresh token expires in and consent expires in, doing what they say. So basically these have to be distinct because they can be different. You could have, say, a user granted 2 months access, but say the authorization server enforces that refresh token rotation must happen no later than 7 days or something like that. Okay, so some questions for the group. Is there a use case for defining parameters for clients to request time limited tokens? As in, this proposal is just scoped to token endpoint response. Is it worth trying to expand it to encapsulate the entire OAuth2 flow, either in, say, the authorization flow request or in the token endpoint request? So if in like the authorization flow request, you could even imagine having it be something integrated with RAR as part of an authorization details. You could specify time limited, something like that could be mentioned. Second question, and this has come up in some hallway conversations and also on the list, which I had missed until I went back to look at it for this presentation, which is the question of expires in versus expires at. Where at is an absolute timestamp and in is relative, a duration. So the 6749 spec has expires in for the access token, so I went with that for consistency. However, some of the advantages of expires at are you can basically, you don't need to, the client doesn't need to check system time to see when it's going to expire. It can potentially do some local caching of a response. It doesn't have to worry about that. That said, if expires at is better, I would probably want to also say that this spec would include regular expires at for the access token as well, so that there's consistency. And then finally, I don't really know the general procedure on this, whether it's worth adding any non-normative implementation notes for how authorization servers might actually do the consent expiration part. Yeah, and then finally, if anyone wants to review it.
I've seen nods, like approval and disapproval at the same time. So let's hear from those people.
I would be interested to know what you thought my reaction was.
Keep going.
For privacy
come on,
reasons,
okay.
you can't.
A lot of stuff. I have come to appreciate the potential value and at least the underlying ideas of this work, mostly through things you've told Aaron that then Aaron explained to me. And so it's nice of him to translate and help me understand the value. But I know consent is a thing in a lot of worlds and implementations, but the word and the concept doesn't appear in the base specification. So I struggle with sort of backporting in a concept, particularly in name parameters, that doesn't normatively exist. And so I also haven't read the draft, so take that for what it's worth. But the way you've described it here is that I get a little nervous about the implications that might have beyond, in the larger context of the community and implementations. And also related, when you talk about expires at and rotation, at least in my little view of the world, those things are not actually related at all. So to the extent you're conflating them, or I've not properly conflated them, I'm also worried about that. That's some very broad, non-actionable feedback, but some more specific ones would be, don't do anything with expires at, especially if it's going to inspire you to try to add it back in places where it didn't already exist, because that's like way overstepping in the context of something where you're trying to add a simple extension, just because maybe there's good reasons. At is better than in some cases, I don't know. But if you have like a nerds piling on to one idea in one context, and that's not reason to like try to wire it back in backwards through the whole thing and add it to the access token and so forth. And maybe I'm not expressing that very well, but
Brian,
that made me super nervous.
Could you explain what you mean by your concerns about the consent? It sounded like it's not an unfamiliar concept in OAuth, right?
I didn't have a chance to check, but I don't believe the word actually appears in the document.
What word does appear then? It must acknowledge some kind of end user action.
Yeah, I mean, is it consent? I don't know. The grant, you're granting access, right?
Okay, I'd be happy to rename it grant expires in.
But I think everyone knows what grant access and confirm, these type of things mean. It's like not that we are super surprised that the user, the resource owner had to grant something, right?
Sure. No, maybe, I don't know. Maybe I'm not expressing myself clearly, but when you start talking about introducing normative constructs to represent things that are only conceptually alluded to, there begins to be the potential for a real disconnect between actual implementations and expectations around it, or mapping into from one to the other. And you probably, this has come up before, people like, the grant is a fairly elusive concept in OAuth, and a lot of different authorization servers have implemented the concept of that grant or the consent or the approval in different ways. And so I think, maybe I'm the only one, I don't know, you will struggle with trying to map a specific concept or name or implementation expectation on that coming back out into a thing like this.
It seems like something that could, I mean, there is a section in 6749 that talks about this. However, it seems like that could be directly referenced. And
it's probably not irreconcilable, and probably you shouldn't listen too much to criticism from someone who just heard the word and hasn't read the draft. But I guess I would encourage us to try to reconcile the potential disconnect or naming problem here. Like I said, it's not super actionable right now, but.
Okay, we have 3 more people and we have 1 minute. Thank you, Brian. So, Justin, please quickly.
Yep, I'll be quick. So I'm with Brian in that this draft would be defining a more concrete management around a concept that is foundational to OAuth, but is not really defined yet. That said, we do have precedent of doing that with dynamic client registration, defining a concrete client model where OAuth previously didn't have one because we needed it. So that might be okay. All that said, the grant management API defined by the OpenID Foundation doesn't deal with expiry directly, but it deals with a lot of this type of concepts. And having helped implement that on top of an existing OAuth server, it can get really squirrely really fast because there are a lot of assumptions in the implementation of OAuth on the auth server side about what each of these concepts really actually does mean, and importantly, the arity between them. Does one grant resolve to multiple refresh tokens, or a single refresh token at a time, or multiple access tokens, et cetera, and so forth? There's no consistent model of what that actually looks like in the OAuth world. And so this work like this would be pulling a thread that I think it doesn't necessarily understand the entirety of the sweater that it's attached to.
Okay.
So I mean, I would say there that, I mean, regarding different implementations and things, I mean, that's why some of this stuff probably needs better definitions, and maybe this should be preceded by some kind of definitional type document in the sense of, like, you know, for example, with respect to multiple refresh tokens and things. I mean, that's why the parameter name doesn't include the word refresh token. Like, it's the intent is for some, like, a higher level concept than that.
Okay.
So.
We are running out of time. We ran out of time already. So Aaron and David, please just very quickly.
Very quickly. The word consent is not in 6749, but the concept is absolutely referred to as resource owner's authorization or approval or grant several times throughout. So the concept, I think, is very much there. I also like that this proposal does not try to boil the ocean of creating a full grant management API, because that is fraught with all sorts of issues. I think this is a nice targeted application of based on an actual need that will provide a concrete difference in the user experience of OAuth clients. So I'm in favor of doing the very specific aspect or mentioned in this draft and not trying to expand the scope to be too broad.
Thanks, Aaron. David.
Agree with not using the term consent in some contexts that might be interpreted as a legal requirement. Second, this seems to be pretty focused, at least in a way, on client action based on AS policy. So understanding that refresh tokens last a certain amount of time, that it's getting close, that they might want to prompt the user was the case given. Those policies are extremely diverse, so I don't know if a client would be able to implement that without knowledge of the specific server's behavior. I don't think this quite gives enough to do that. So in other words, if you have a refresh token and I lasted a month and 2 days before I refresh it again, they say, here's your new 2-day refresh token, that didn't provide any value.
I think I'm just going to have to disagree.
Okay.
With that.
Yeah, you can disagree after that. Dick, very quickly, please.
Yeah. Consent is on page 59 of the spec.
Thanks,
Thank
Dick.
you.
Don't use the list where nobody can see.
Yeah, because
okay.
we have remote people.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone.
Guys.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Yaron Zahavi. It's my first time. I'm really excited. And my presentation is about a case of native apps when one native app is an auth client, the other native app is the authorization server, but they are across different trust domains. And the experience that is resulting from that, and can it be improved? So setting the stage, RFC 8252 introduced app to web, the idea that a client app here on the left can consume an authorization server and get the response back to it using claimed URLs. So that works great. A few years later, Joseph here wrote the blog on app to app, basically changing the right side and saying, well, we don't have to do that authentication authorization on the browser. This can be a native app on the right side, answering the native app on the left side. So that's great, works in the field. But then this proposal actually focuses on the case where the client app and the authorization server app are on the same trust domain. So basically the app on the left is a client of the authorization server on the right. But what if they are separated? Which is a case when you have bigger systems of federation, like in academia or in the business world, which is a use case we have in real life that we want to solve. We are a group of banks and we want to launch an app generally and have it run in one trust domain and consume and serve our 12 countries where there are already daily banking apps. So we have an app on the left, we have an app on the right, and then in the middle could be any number of other trust domains that just federate and 302 redirect that call. So when you have that use case, that works, but it requires the help of the browser. So all these middle redirections that don't yet serve the user, but say, oh, I got you, now I'm gonna direct you to the next trust domain, to the next trust domain. All those middle ones in gray get served by the browser. So this works, but it doesn't provide the best user experience. Some of you, I've shown during this week a demo of this. If you haven't seen it and want to see it, reach out to me. So basically, this thumbs down is what happens when you show it to the business owners. They don't like it. It might break in some cases. So if the app that outgoes, so if this arrow on the top uses one opinionated browser, like for example, a web view, but then the other app comes back on a different browser, that's a bad choice, don't do it, but it's gonna break because the cookies might not be there. It's gonna break the flow. Even if it doesn't break the flow, it's not so clean. Some browsers, when they handle deep links, prompt the user, do you wanna open this link? They might leave this tab left as clutter. It's slow, it's stuttery for the user, it's not the best user experience. So what we're trying to do is find a way to bridge over these trust domains without needing the browser. Therefore, browserless app to app. Oh, there's one slide missing. All right. Basically, the idea, and thanks to those folks who have come forward and given some feedback during this week, but the idea is that the client app here shall be its own user agent, not need the browser as the user agent. So as it calls out to its initial authorization server in its trust domain, it gets a redirect. It checks, it can use OS SDKs in iOS and Android and check, oh, I got a URL here, is this claimed on the device? If so, go to it. So it goes to the user authenticating app. If not, it can call it directly. So that's arrows 3. It just calls it in a loop, and as it gets redirects, it follows and follows and follows until one of them falls on the user authenticating app. And then that app authenticates, the user authorizes the operation, and there it needs to have a leap of trust. That's why this is a proposal. We need a mechanism to share this deep link URL between the two apps and have the user authenticating app do something against all best current practices, which is not go to that redirect URL, but trust this native callback URL and say, I trust you, brah, and I'm gonna go there and give you this callback and the redirect URL, and you as a user agent in arrow 7 can walk back this line that you went through. Now, there are ways to establish this trust, such as OpenID federation and automatic client registration, or simply in closed ecosystems, this could be pre-registered trust. Yeah, so that is the basic proposal. And basically, as I said, the client app is its own user agent. It detects each URL that it handles, it detects if there's an app on the device. If it encounters a response that's not a redirect, not a 3xx redirect, like an HTML page, it's not going to render the HTML. It's going to say, okay, doesn't work. I'm going to use the browser because I have to. Maybe on the user's device is not the AAS app, or maybe this authorization server needs to interact with the user, so it's not going to work. So there needs to be the fallback option. And then there's the mechanism how to convey this native callback URL between the apps. So there's one question of trusting it. There's a second question of transferring it. And there have been different proposals, like a structured scope, a custom new parameter. And some of the feedback I've gotten this week got me thinking along the lines of a RAR body. So simply a rich authorization request carrying this over. We presented this at the latest OSW. We have an active use case that needs this. That's what prompted us to action. The University of Stuttgart, Tim Wortle and Pedram, who were there, reached out to us, and we want to collaborate with them once this gets further down the line and do the security analysis. And basically, we're here requesting your feedback and support, asking people to read this and say what they think about it. And those who gave feedback during this week, thank you very much. This has been very helpful. One of the proposals, by the way, that Joseph gave just yesterday was for a metadata option. So an authorization server can declare that they support this and say, I have an authorization endpoint, as we know, but I have a native authorization endpoint. And by specifying, it might be the same endpoint, but by specifying it, they commit to this profile that they're gonna pass on this structured scope or the RAR body. And that's all I have to say.
Anshang Schuster. I just wanted to give the feedback I gave you on the floor here as well. And that is, what I know is when you have this sort of federation chain, most of the time an authorization server will ask the user for a choice, right? So you would be able to choose from the various authorization servers you want to do. And in very little cases, you would have authorization server, the moment you contact them, send you back a 301, 301, 301 all the time, right? So I wonder how you would solve that. And I asked you that, but I just wanted to bring it up here as well.
Yeah, a very fair point, and thank you for this feedback. I don't have a solution yet. Maybe those authorization, okay, one option is to not support it. The draft always has the fallback that says, I didn't make it, I'm gonna use the browser. So as I said, this app-to-app over browsers works. So it's always a fallback option. I try to think about the option that I mentioned to you about setting those cookies and using them for next, but that won't work because you set them on the browser where the user chose and you don't have them on the app. So I don't have a solution for that yet, but thanks for the feedback. I did mark it down on the latest review as cases that won't work.
Okay, Nick?
Nick Doty, Center for Democracy and Technology. Thanks for the presentation. I'm still trying to think through the concept, so this is just a question that I'm trying to think through. It seems like one of the advantages of using the browser in OAuth grants is that we're sort of teaching the user, you do your authentication on the origin that you expect. Like you look at that URL bar, oh, that's the website I want to be on to give my password or other authentication. In the app-to-app case, I'm sort of confused about like what is the user going to see or know about when they're doing this authentication. That they end up in another app. There's some flash on the screen. They end up in another app. That's the app where they should type in their password or provide their authenticator. I'm worried that in getting away from the browser, that we might be undermining that situation where we just teach the user, just fill in your password and click OK, whatever screen comes up?
Thank you. That's a great question, and Mike gave me the same feedback when we met, and I put it into the security considerations. So this works for cases where the redirection does not interact with the user. So what the user will see is that they started on an app on the left, and then he clicked sign in, and he bounced to the app on the right. He won't feel on the middle. So it's not like this use case that the BCP talked about, that don't use your own browser and have like keystroke potentially stealing the user's credentials. There's no interaction. So basically the app on the left is just connected as an HTTP client, calling OAuth like an API, getting a 302 and following. So there won't be such interaction. All the user will see, I've went from the app on the left to the app on the right, authenticated, and I'm back on the other app. That's a desired experience.
Okay. Over time, unfortunately, Aaron. Thank you. And
who's willing to read this and provide feedback? Thanks,
awesome.
Arndt.
Yeah,
Thanks,
perfect.
Philip.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Awesome. Thanks. Okay, Jeff. I think Arndt and Philip, right? Anybody else?
See you.
Okay, so.
Oh, it's run now.
This
Great.
one?
Yes,
Another?
that's good. Bonjour à tous et bienvenue à notre draft en français. So my name is Jeff Lombardo, and so today we talked about client extension claims, something that I wrote with my peer who is also French but living on the other side of the Canada in Vancouver. We are both Canadian. So I did try to match the tone of this working group, so bear with me. So I think we should be able to describe any security mechanism that has been used into a transaction in between a client and an authorization server. Okay, so that's the purpose of this picture I took randomly onto the internet. And we did that. We did that before for the subject, and it's okay so far. There are a lot of discussion if we should continue to talk about user authentication factors or not and come to more things, but we have ACR, AMR, and yes, we are fine with that and we can live with it. But there are a number of frameworks that require, when you try to implement those, that there are specific client-oriented requirements that needs to be fulfilled. Like, for example, at the beginning of this year, FAPI 2.0 security profile was GA. Congrats to that. And they have like re-established or strengthen some of the requirements for that. Like, for example, the necessity to have like MTLS as a client authentication mechanism, to use DPOP as a mechanism also in order to be sure that those tokens are effectively constrained to the sender. They have also some part which says that you can use private key jot. I think that through this working group also this week I saw a lot, and Arndt did that a few minutes ago, describe like new other methods that will come in order like to provide additional options for the client authentication. So that's great. That's a requirement. We need to abide by that. That's another point for me. I'm very interested into that, but you might not know that the healthcare industry is governed by FHIR. The identity and access management part of FHIR is driven by something which is called SMART. So SMART on FHIR is identity and access management for any healthcare information data exchange. And they are doing the same thing. Into the implementation requirements, they are saying that the client must be authenticated a certain way in order to be supported for the interactions. So when we try to see how the client did it, we start to see that this is complex. So yes, there was some improvement onto identifying the type of tokens But until it is completely supported by the whole ecosystem, it's a little bit of a mess. How can we differentiate an identity token from an access token? I know that this is OpenID Connect on one side and OAuth on the other, but just bear with me a minute. It's a very long list of potentially if-else switch statement in order to know what is the type of the token. We don't have, or we have very few clue about what is the type of authorization grant flow that was used. Is it device code, client credentials, SIBAP? We don't know, we just have an access token. Which type of bindings? So yes, for Depop, we have some elements, and sorry for the typo on this slide, but was PXE used, RAR, PAR, JAR? That might be complex to do that. Okay, and finally, for the type of client authentication, was it like a private JOT, MTLS? We saw that some framework requires that. But when we are knocking at the door of the resource server, we don't have all the information to be able to enforce that. So I know that there has been some improvement into all of that, especially onto the tip header field in order to allow us to do that. So pop quiz, which one of those is a valid tip header? Okay, there is like, we try to convey information into that, but it starts to become complex. From my point of view, we might have like a tip explosion. It might be complex to be able to process that. At least we don't have the client authentication method. And when it is processed by policy decision point into the backend, those policy decision point might have access to the payload, but they don't have access to the header. So the message which is truncated on this slide is that we beg to differ and we would like those information to be inside the payload. So this is what we are proposing over here, okay? And sorry again, next time I will take the template of the working group because it seems like we don't have the same size of screen. So we want to introduce 4 new claims into the token. The first one, which is called GTY, that will describe the grant type flow used. That would be a mono-value string and can identify with something very small in order to not blot the token again. What is the flow which is used? Which is great is that Okta, our friends at Okta, are already using that. We want to talk about CXT. So for CXT, we want to be able to describe all the authentication, client authentication extension method that has been used, like for example, PXE, Depop, RAR, PAR, JAR. So it can be multiple, a combination of all of those or a subset of those. So that's why we want something which is more like a representation of the scope claim into that. Yes, we know that there is the tip header field, but I just showed you earlier that this is not sufficient. We want a CCR claim, nothing related to the music group for that. We just want to be able to provide the equivalent of the ACR claims that we have for users, but for client. So we want to be able to define some maybe namespace for us to be able to carry trust within the token in between the AS and the ARS. And the last one that you might not see at the bottom, which is CMR, sorry, which is the equivalent of AMR, is like really describing the client authentication method that has been used for this token to be issued into the first place. And again, we will provide some values that we will try to register with Yana in order to be sure that we are speaking the same language moving forward. So with my co-author and with some first reviewer, we decided to start this personal draft. We made some version onto that, describing the claims. The good thing is that we are not introducing any new request parameter. What we are expecting is that as soon as an authorization server will support this proposal, if it made through the process and is accepted at some point into the future, they won't have to change anything. They can just return those 4 claims. What they can do is that they can piggyback onto the authorization server metadata and just indicate into the authorization server metadata that they are capable of doing so. So for that, we are introducing grant type extension that will be Yana entries that we will register. We have processed some issue in order to make it clear the connection with the FAPI 2.0 and the Smart on Fire element, and we want to thank our reviewer. Open for question.
Questions, comments? Here we go.
So not having read the draft, but it feels like it might be similar to something that Justin did a couple of years ago called vectors of trust. That is exactly a way to represent different components that go into a trust decision and then combine that into an ACR URI. And it is sort of a fairly simple string-based format for combining stuff like this, right? So it's RFC 8584. No, is it 8485?
Okay.
Yeah, let me, yeah.
I know Vector of Trust, from my perspective, Vector of Trust was an extension of NIST SP 863.
No.
No? Okay.
No. Vectors of Trust is a mechanism for representing information that go into a trust decision.
Okay.
So if you look at the classical way to describe trust framework, they're all sort of AL 1, 2, 3, and it's sort of hierarchical, right? But VOT was meant as a way to componentize that, which is kind of what you're trying to do. So the fact that the 863-4 adopted it, but it's completely independent from there. Yeah.
Thank you.
One of the amazing things that Vittorio did when he was drafting JWT access tokens was go around, get the existing JWT access token formats from all the vendors and compare what they do similarly, what they do differently, and try to come up with something which can be a unifying factor, let's call it that. Out of the 4 claims, you've already mentioned that one of them is seen to be used in the wild. If you're saying Okta is doing so, that's great. OUT0 is doing that as well. And I'm fairly certain that the values in those will not be the same. Like the value of the GTY claim will not be the same, even between those two. So maybe look for a different claim name or look carefully to make sure that the expected values that you define are the same in all existing uses of the, at this point, non-standard GTY claim. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
So we are looking for reviewers if you want to join onto that.
Okay, so you stay here because we are going for this one, right?
Yes, and again, broken format. Sorry for that. So, hey, I'm Jeff. You might have seen me before into client extension claims. So this draft is a little bit larger. So we have a larger number of authors onto that. I want to thank, on top of Alex, George Fletcher and Yaron, which is in the room to help us draw that. So the idea is to try to go further than what late Vittorio Bertocci did with step-up authentication at the authorization layer. So pictures again. So we are glad that a resource provider can signal the fact that you cannot move forward. But we will be grateful to know why we cannot move forward. Is it because I don't have the proper certification to mountain climb this part? Is it because it's not good to do it in between noon and 2? Is it for any other reason? We might want more details into that. So again, if we come back to those example of framework implementation requirements, we went through FAPI 2.0 and Smart on Fire onto what they can require in terms of client authentication requirements. But that's not the only thing. They are also supporting rich authorization request, which is great. The last thing that I want to say is that now, thanks to a shared signal framework that Atul has presented at the security open meeting this morning, the resource provider might change of decision. Something that was good at some point in time, even if you come back with an equivalent credential later on, it might not be good enough anymore. And that's why we want to be able to carry those signals, and we want to be able to piggyback onto the fact that those clients that are FAPI 2.0 or Smart on Fire can support rich authorization request to try to bound, to connect what the resource server can return and what the client can do with the authorization server. So we want to be sure that when we want to guide the OAuth client to the next stage, the resource server has more capabilities that he has today. Okay, but we don't want to get rid of the capabilities that exist as of today. Like, for example, if you want to return a 401 or a 403 plain without, or dry, I should say, Canada dry, I should say, without any additional flavor into it, you can do that. But if you can, and if you feel that you can provide more signaling to the client, you should be able to do that. RFC 9470, which is the step-up authentication, started that by saying, okay, we can return more through the www-authenticate BIRA header, in order to guide towards maybe a different ACR or maybe like a more recent authentication. But we want to be able to do something same at the authorization layer. So that's why we want to be able to complete the puzzle picture over here by adding a type of response that can provide this form of signaling by respecting the www-authenticate header and what was proposed before into this area. So what we are doing here, as you can see, is that we are adding like some specific authorization code, some specific error code, sorry, and we will try to create some specific challenges. We will respect two specific challenges. The first one is the ability for DRS to say, hey, go see my OAuth2 protected resource metadata. You might find more information over there. And that's great because it's an RFC now. Or we might say, okay, let me guide you into what you can do beyond the point. And for that, because it's related to authorization, we decided to use the OAuthN format as the envelope of the response that we want to return. So we are, what we have done into our proposal with the author is that, yeah, we make the connection, like I said, with the FAPI 2.0 and the Smart on Fire specification. Also what with MCP is doing, because MCP is going also the way we step up authentication support into that. That's why we are expanding around that. When we proposed that at OSW, it was more convoluted solutions than what we have at the moment. We like rationalized the proposal to only one error code around that, and we tried to make the connection with the other RFCs that exist or standards like UMA 2.0, the protected resource metadata, like I said, but also new things that are being worked at the OpenID Connect Foundation with the eKYC advanced syntax for claims. So in a nutshell, what happened over here is that when the client made the first request to the resource server can give a response, which would be this famous challenge that we are creating. And then what we are expecting is that the client through the user agent will make a new authorization request to the AS. And we expect in the case of this example that it will be a RAR request. And on the right side, you can see the response from the resource server. And I'm glad this one kept the format of the slide because that's the important part. And as you can see, here we have the OAuthN response envelope, and inside it, you are just finding the RAR example that is into the RAR specification. So it's for a payment. The resource server knows exactly what it wants and is guiding the client. There is no thinking from the client to have. He has all the elements to just talk to the AS with that. And if everything is okay, maybe get a new access token that will allow the client to finally being able to talk to the resource server and maybe access the resource if nothing has changed on the resource server side for the access control evaluation. So again, we solve a certain number of issues, especially into the security section. What we have done is that we took into account the fact that you might come onto the first request to the RS without any token in the first place, because that's something which is possible into UMA 2.0. We still need to look into GANAP to see if we are well aligned with GANAP, because that's the new mental models that we should align for. And I want to thank all the reviewers, especially our peers at the Raiffeisen Bank, for what they help us with that. Open for question. Okay, so if not, I have question for you. First issue is that we decided to go 403. And we know that there is a whole debate in between 401, 403. We decided to go 403 just in order to respect step-up authentication and just to differentiate ourselves from that. But we know that the OAUTH framework and UMA 2.0 only formalize the usage of 401, and that some of the server might consider 403 as a final stage that cannot being negotiated beyond that. So we want also to feedback from reviewers onto that and external views to help us guide onto that. Nick, I see you are the mic.
Yeah, so I just came up to say that I support this. I think it is quite useful to be able to express a wide variety of error conditions that can happen in real life servers, either recoverable or otherwise, where the important thing is being able to get back to the authorization server so that the authorization server can try to resolve it one way or the other. 401 versus 403, I would like to think about this, but I'm not going to ad-lib something right now.
Okay, thank you, Nick. So other question we want to solve is like the payload in body or header. We got plenty of very good discussion during IETF off meeting, I will say, aka diner or lunch, onto the fact that, yeah, passing information through the payload might break a lot of things and maybe using the header is better. Just in touch about that, onto the fact that maybe passing a JOT into the header, into one of those former discussion today, because it's a JOT, it's formatted, so for the client to be able to process it, it's still okay. So that's something we will work on. And again, if there are some reviewers that want to join us into that, to be able to sort it out, that would be appreciated. And finally, it's something that, yeah, I won't talk about that because I got my answer during this week. So let's skip to those 2 points. I'm glad because the proposal just reached like skepticism in between yeah and nay within this room. So that's the third state. Thank you.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Jeff. Justin.
All right. If I can get slide control, thank you. So this is going to be pretty quick. The idea behind pushed client registration has popped up a couple of times over the years, and finally decided to actually write this down. So if you look at OAuth 2 at its core, we have a client ID because everything is originally built around the authorization code flow. And since you start in the front channel, you can't authenticate. So you need to identify instead of authenticate to kick off the process. And then you later authenticate bound to that identifier. Thing is, though, we've hung a lot of stuff off of that client ID, even though it doesn't fit every model. So ephemeral clients like SPA instances, native app instances, things like that, we put client IDs on them, even though the client ID doesn't really mean the same thing as it does with a registered website, which is, if we'll recall, how OAuth kind of got its start. We've come up with a bunch of ways to kind of get around this limitation. So dynamic registration lets you register a new client ID, but of course, if you have an ephemeral client that disappears as soon as the auth is over, then that client ID is not really doing you much good later. OpenID Federation, client ID metadata fetch documents, and SPIFFE IDs all give us other approaches to dealing with client IDs. And this topic came up again in a recent discussion that Aaron and I were having with the MCP folks around how you actually connect to the MCP proxy, because the nature of the client ID going into the MCP, of the client application going into the MCP proxy, in some cases is a completely ephemeral local application that is bound into a controlled context that that the agent has. It's not always necessarily going to be a hosted application, not really going to always be a sort of a stable location for the application, even though sometimes it is, and other approaches are being pursued in the MCP community to address those. But in some cases, it might make more sense to actually kind of forego a client ID. And to do that, I rolled together basically starting with PAR. You can actually trace through an entire OAuth transaction without actually leaning on a client ID if you are in these specific circumstances, by using a special syntax. So I'm going to walk through what that looks like right now. So the client makes a PAR request, and instead of putting a real client ID, it has this special keyword, which is a URI that ends in dynamic. And I do not want to bike shed that term here because it's almost certainly wrong. But for the purposes of this presentation, I'll just keep using the word, the client ID static value of dynamic here. Point is that this is a flag to the AS that says this isn't a real client ID. This is a client that is just introducing itself. Importantly here, the client pushes all of the request information like it normally would in PAR, but it also pushes the client metadata document that is defined with OAuth dynamic client registration. But what it gets back, unlike dynamic registration, which spits out a client ID, what it gets back is just a request URI, normal PAR response. So that client then goes and fetches the request at the authorization endpoint with its request URI, and it puts in this keyword dynamic. Now, at this point, the AS can actually attach whatever was in that URI back to the original request, which has all of the client metadata without needing a client ID. And so we get the authorization code back, assuming authorization code flow being used here. This can be optimized in a handful of different ways, but we'll stick to the auth code flow. At which point the client now has the auth code, and it can go make a request to the token endpoint with the authorization code. Again, using the client ID dynamic and proof of any keys from that original pushed authorization request where it introduced itself. So at this point, the AS can take the code, dereference that to the request URI, and dereference that to the original request information, which has all of the key information that the client introduced itself initially with, without using a client ID. You're going to see this as a theme here. So you get back an access token and a refresh token, which the client can then use at the RS. And then the RS can then dereference it back to whatever set of key bindings or whatever it needs to do to get the information about that initial request that the client had to make. So there are some benefits of this approach in the specific case where it's where I think it makes sense. You don't have an extra round trip to do dynamic registration, which ends up with kind of a vestigial client ID hanging around that you eventually need to clean up. We saw this in the early days of deploying dynamic registration with some of the medical record projects that I was involved in. We had JavaScript apps that would stand up and then burn down, and then we would have hundreds of client IDs sitting around that were never to be used again because the software instance that initiated them just disappeared. You don't need to host metadata for your clients, so you can keep things very instance specific. You can keep them pushed, but you can also push things like client attestations and software statements or any other bits that we can tie into the into sort of the client trust infrastructure, because this is intentionally meant to build on top of that client metadata model that dynamic registration gives us. The key difference is that you don't get back a client ID to use, and you just use this flag that allows the AS to trace it through the entire system. So I think it's a pretty simple way to stack together mostly existing OAuth pieces to enable some leverage of intent registration for ephemeral instances. Is this a problem that we want to solve? This is what I'm asking in the working group. I think it's interesting. I don't think it's actually all that complex to implement. And I've played around with a little bit of implementation. Y'all know me, I like building things, and it seems to work. I couldn't find any, my gut's not screaming at me that this is a terrible idea, but I'd like to see from the community, is this something that we actually want to work on specifying and building out? Is it going to reach enough use cases for this to make sense?
Thanks, Justin. Any comments, questions, suggestions? Oh, Brian, yeah, I know.
Thanks, Justin. I'm curious about this. I'll go that far. We seem to have the same concept like coming up. How do we, you know this, but like how do we identify and somehow deal with scale and first use establishment of client information? So curious, I guess. I do start to wonder about we're now seem to be even amongst this group have several different or more ideas floating around about how to do that. I don't know if it's certainly indicative of the problem space we want to address. I wonder if there should be that many, if they could and should coexist, or if we should try to pick one to rule them all, or I don't know. I don't know. But yes, curious.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. And it was really interesting seeing how many times client ID solutions have been coming up in conversation just this week alone. I think that our community as a whole is kind of running into the limitations of the assumptions that we made about client IDs back 15 years ago, and trying to see how this fits in the new world.
Arndt.
Hey, Justin, this is Arndt. What resonates very well with me is the ephemeralness of clients in your draft. And I think maybe this is something that it's not just about the push client registration sort of thing. I think the ephemeralness is something that I do really like, because it prevents a whole set of operational issues you would normally have with that, right? So yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I do want to reinforce that if we were to pick this up, I would want us to have very firm guardrails around where this makes sense, because this being misapplied in some type of highly trusted environment without the type of infrastructure that, I don't know, something like Spiffy that Peter might be about to talk about would give you would be a problem. But in cases where you don't have that or don't need that, that's where I believe it makes sense.
Peter Castleman, yes, I think this is an important problem to go solve, just because we see it pop up in so many places. I think we're seeing different solutions being proposed because there are sort of different angles on this thing, right? Depending on where you come from. I think it's worth the discussion, and maybe we need some kind of interim looking to the chairs to talk about, I think this is the third or fourth proposal. It'd be an interesting discussion just to see if there is some commonality or what the opportunity might be.
Yeah, if people are interested, I'm happy to.
Yeah, I'd be interested in an interim on the client ID topic in general.
Okay, Leif.
So Leif Johansson, also here to add my support for some sort of thinking exercise around this. I had a chat with several of the people who are involved in the OpenID Federation work this week who aren't here, but some who are. And I think there is a consensus in that community that we have this whole section in the OID Fed spec that is essentially client registration that also needs to kind of what changed, right? Because we need to be able to build OID Fed in a way that is compatible with whatever the OAuth community is doing, right? And this would mean that we would be also very, very interested, I think, in contributing and working on something that allows us to move forward in more, coherent way. I'm reminded of how it was looking at the SIP community when that got started many years ago, and it wound up having like so many specs that you couldn't read them in a lifetime, right? And many of them with overlapping and conflicting goals. Just might be good not to wind up there.
That's okay. We'll just have OAuth 2.2.
Okay, good. Justin, let's switch to your last presentation here.
Yep, and all right. As soon as I get control, thank you. All right, this is a follow-up to something that we presented at the last IETF, and we had an interim about this. I'm not going to go into the details of the draft, but the basic idea is that there are a lot of use cases where you want to be able to bind a token to a key without being able to present proof of that key. So you're deferring presentation of the bound key to later in the process after the token has actually been issued. There's a lot of good reason to not do this in a lot of use cases, and that's why sort of the core OAuth proof of possession mechanisms that we already have out there, most notably Depop and MTLS, require you to present proof of the key before the token is bound to that key, to prevent exactly this type of AES impersonation attack where an attacker's AES goes and gets a key and hands it over and pretends that it is for you, or that it is from them, right? But the thing is, the real world is not that simple. This is from the identity chaining draft. There's a need to bind a key from a different domain in a way that the target resource can verify the presenter, but the requesting one would not be able to make that request in the same way. So there are infrastructures that allow you to trust keys across domains, X509 being a very famous one, that this might actually make some sense, but there are others out there. The basic idea boils down to allowing the client to say, hey, I have my identity that I can prove, but the token that you give me, I want it bound to somebody else's keys. And so I want you to give me back the token that is bound to somebody else's keys. And trust me, I am allowed to do this. This shows up a lot in the workload space. If you think of a Spiffy agent getting a token issued on behalf of a workload and then handing it to the workload without the Spiffy agent actually having the private key for that workload to do that, this shows up there. So anyway, we had an interim on this, and what we really want to ask the working group is, what do we do about this? The problem space is out there, and people are solving this in kind of odd ways right now, in a handful of sort of policy ways. We would really like to figure out where to go next with this. So the first thing that we can do is just ignore this, which has been mentioned as an option on list, which I appreciate. And that's that we just declare that this is bad practice. You shouldn't do this. And anybody that's doing this is bad and not being secure. That's not going to stop them from doing it because they're already doing that, even though the current specs say don't, this is not a way to solve this. Next up, we could document existing patterns and use cases and sort of put the guardrails up around the very bad practices and, limit stuff so that people only apply this in cases where it does make sense. But next, we could actually build out a protocol spec. We could formalize a way of presenting the confirmation key that you don't hold as part of the token request. So this would be an extension that would fold into MTLS and Depop and any other signed presentation mechanisms, including HTTP SIG and other stuff that people are using out there, that would allow you to do this type of deferred key binding. And finally, do we also want to have some type of token data spec? So jot and introspection and whatever all else that says that, hey, this is the key that that the token was bound to, but it wasn't presented at the time of issuance. And so, yeah, basically, if what do we want to do as a community at this point? I think we got Peter in the queue.
This is a problem that we've come across in other places as well. I think not doing anything about it doesn't help anybody. Options 2 and 3 seems like the best, maybe the best ways to have some kind of interoperability, if we, which is the thing that you kind of, for some of the scenarios that you showed, authorization servers talking to authorization servers, probably want some kind of interoperability there. So I think 2 or 3, if we could find a way to do that, would be great. If not, at least BCPs. But 2 and 3 to me seems like if we had that, that would be fantastic.
Peter, you mentioned you've seen this in other places as well. Could you elaborate?
So certainly, when we were working on the identity chaining and cross-domain draft, this was a scenario that came up. We described this in the appendix as well there. We also have similar sort of patterns that you will find in things like Istio ambient mode, etc., right, where the entity that is requesting doesn't necessarily have the key to which the token is going to be bound, right? That kind of pattern. You see that in other places as well. And so you have a lot of these sort of proxy type models where there's a proxy that's requesting a token and the key is held somewhere else. And so formalizing that or giving guidance on that, I think, will be a great help.
Yeah, and you also, I've also seen this in practice in an IoT type situation where you have hardware issued keys on the devices that are coming from a trusted CA, and so issuing a token to a hardware bound key is like, that is a valid way to do this in a way that everybody in the scenario can actually trust it. But none of our protocols approach that. It's very similar to the Istio mode that Peter just mentioned.
I'm Frank Schuster. I'll keep it brief because we don't have much time. I worry with the claim that it can be easily misused. I can see it happening, being, oh, this claim looks exactly what I need, and just picking it up, right? And let's talk offline about the spiffy situation, because I'm not fully sure I'm on board with that. But yeah, I think it's a valid problem. I just worry that it can be misused in very, very many bad ways.
Yeah, I share your worry, Arndt, which is why I don't think option 0 is a good idea at all.
Yeah. Now that both of these guys have spoken, I don't have much more to add, to be honest. I have seen something very similar in cross-enterprise scenarios, including in data spaces, for example, where this actually happens very, very common when you have visible proxies like connectors and stuff like that. My gut feeling is that don't do 2 or 3 on their own. You should combine 2 and 3. 3 will help with reducing some of the security risks of 2. Warning that this is dangerous. Okay, I think that was mentioned before, and I agree with that. But on the other hand, not doing anything about it will be very difficult. Still, it is not clear in my mind that you can totally eliminate the use of some form of policy or some kind of dynamic behavior in that. I'm not sure that this is possible to do without any of this. Other than that, I think that's worth addressing the problem with these concerns, and also perhaps have a parallel analysis of situations where this is necessary and cannot be avoided by some means of token exchange together with bearing tokens. So situations where you actually really have to do it, and there is no other way of using more, let's say, less risky ways of achieving the same result with a little bit of overhead.
I wanted to just disagree with Peter again, because that's what I'm doing today. The zero, he said zero doesn't help anybody, but it would help the people that don't have to do the work to try to do 1, 2, or 3. So there is a benefit there. And I say that a little bit tongue in cheek, but I think it is harder than we think, and that trying to do the work might be a lot of work. That said, it is a problem, and yeah, it's a weird place to be in, because my name's listed on the document that Justin largely wrote, and it's a lovely piece of work that you did in really an impressive time frame. But I do really worry about the implications on all of us and our attention and our ability to get things done and actually solve problems if we try to tackle it.
So Brian, is your preference option 1 instead, or do you still think option 2 or 3 are?
I think I have a slight tendency to prefer option 0.
Option 0, okay.
Yeah.
Interesting, okay.
Because I'm lazy. I'm lazy, and I worry about work consuming us.
Okay, thanks. Fair, Brian. David.
I think if we do decide this is valid, then 2 and 3 are better than 1. And the reason why is we want to be able to indicate this is happening. And SAML, that would have been in subject confirmation data. CNF kind of, if you squint, was designed to do that, but kind of not.
Almost, yeah.
Yeah. But some way to say, like, critical understanding this token, like presentation of this proof of possession doesn't mean what you think it means, would be very important if this is actually being done in the wild, to guide Rail people into at least being explicit with that and having a way to have policy to understand that. I don't know if this is needed, if we should do 0 or 1, but my preference is if we are pushing people that this is valid, that we be pretty explicit about it.
All right, thank you all.
Thanks, David.
Yeah, chairs, we look to you to figure out if we want to do some type of motion in the working group to figure out what to do next. The call is not to adopt the draft as it's written. The draft as it's written is just really the problem.
Yeah, so we could start a thread on the mailing list to ask the work group what they want to do with this, but I think it's like it's Friday and people are tired, so let's do that on the mailing list. Sounds good?
Sounds good. Thank you all.
Awesome. Thanks, Justin, and thank you all. And that's it. We're done. You're free. Oh, hey, Nat. You want to say something?
Hey. No. I was just saying bye.
Well,
it's
good,
almost
good to
midnight
see you,
here.
man. Okay.
Bye.
Bye.